let's start.
Yes, let's go.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Francisco Alvarez. I'm the executive director of the galleries here at OCAD University. And I'd like to welcome you to Onsite Gallery. Onsite is our public-facing gallery, but we have a number of other galleries tucked away in the various buildings. What we do is we present professional artists and designers to sort of enrich the curriculum, and also for the public to come and see the sort of state of the art in practice, in curation, and in art design and new media. I'd like to acknowledge first that OCAD University is on the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, and that we are very proud and pleased to share the land and steward the land with them today. So for this afternoon's talk, we have our two video curators for this exhibition, Fable for Tomorrow, a survey of work by Wendy Coburn, which runs until May 14th. So be sure to tell your friends, come back. We have a number of other events also coming up. And what's really special about this event is this is our first live event in 2 years. 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago. So welcome. March 14th was our last, of 2020 was our last opening day before COVID. And since that time, we haven't done any events in the gallery. So this is the very first one. We've had a few class tours and things like that, but sort of this type of public event. So welcome and share the joy of that with us. So I'll introduce our two curators who will be leading us through the video-based works in this exhibition and talking about Wendy as a person, as a friend, as a colleague, and of course as a very important Canadian artist that we're really trying to situate in Canadian art history through this exhibition. So I'll start. b.h. Yael is a filmmaker and installation artist. A book about her work called Family States, edited by Mike Holbloom and published by Conversalon, was released in 2021. Yael is a professor of integrated media at OCAD University and also teaches in the Art and Social Change program. In 2021, Yael was visiting scholar at Massey College. Yael's films and installations have dealt with the many intersections of identity and family, have focused on activist initiatives in Palestine, Israel, and also focused on apocalypse, geopolitical and environmental urgencies. She has programmed screenings and arts lectures, including Art Creates Change at OCAD University. Thank you, Yael. And Rebecca Garrett is our second video curator. Rebecca is a visual and media artist whose award-winning photo-based works, videos, and installations have been exhibited in Canada and abroad. She has worked collaboratively with many groups and individuals in Canada, Denende, the USA, Zimbabwe, and Kenya, and has taught at York University, the University of Toronto, and of course, the Ontario College of Art Design. Her work expresses a long commitment to naming economic, colonial, and social injustices, and building relations of exchange and reciprocity. A book about her work called Search, also edited by Mike Holbloom and published by Conversalon, was released in 2020. So welcome both of you, and I'll pass the baton to you.
Thank you. I'm going to start with just a few thanks right off the top. Thank you to Onsite Gallery, to the staff for facilitating these presentations. Thank you to Lisa and to Susan and to Francisco. Thanks also to Omar over there and Renzi, who have been working in IT and assisting us. And thank you to Vlad, who's pointing the camera at me, Vlad Kanich, who is documenting. And this talk will be broadcast on OCADU Live, so at least it'll have a little bit of an afterlife. We would also like to thank Caroline Langill and Andrea Fatona, who are the curators of the show and who invited Rebecca and I to program the video component. And I would like to thank Rebecca, before her for the collaboration, for conversations, for deliberations, sensitivities, and critical and acute perceptions. As we prepared, we did an online panel around Slut Walk about last February of 21. We wrote the brochure essay, and now we're doing this talk together. So it's been actually a really lovely way to just revisit Wendy's life, Wendy's work, and to do that together. So, we're going to give a few general comments here, and then we're going to be walking around. So the exhibition, first providing some general observations. We're going to talk about a piece that's actually not in the show. And then Rebecca will be talking about their Troon, which is over here. Then we're going to go over there to My Heart Divine, and then we're going to go over there to Slut Walk. So we'll do a little bit of a run through. None of what we say is definitive. It struck me after the panel with Ian Carr-Harris and Liz Magor and Barbara Fisher that everyone has a piece of Wendy. And some of these perceptions and experiences converge, and many are disparate. They were confirmed in a few conversations this past week, and I revisited my eulogy to Wendy at her memorial and realized some of the same sentiments had been expressed there. So I'm just going to read you a tiny little bit from that. We can be sure there are layers and layers of understanding, and each one of us holds one or a few pictures that make the whole. We each have a picture of Wendy, or many images of her. If we were to bring all of those images together, it would be more representative, but still not complete. The frame limits and makes the image, and we are that frame. We hold the fragments, and we love all the pieces, the residue, and the memories of Wendy. In more formal talks, we talk about the artists by their last name, like Coburn did this and Coburn did that, but I don't think we can do that here because Wendy was very much part of our lives. And so we first thought we would just let you know who Wendy was in our lives.
Okay. Gosh. I guess first I just wanted to thank Yael for that. And reiterate all of the thanks that Yael made to other people, but also to Yael, and it has been an amazing experience to be able to work through Wendy's work in a really serious way. Because of COVID, we ended up with a lot of time to be able to actually feel we were doing it really properly and giving it the attention it was due. And I think I definitely discovered a lot of things about both Wendy's work and about Yael and about myself during the process. So I really appreciate that. Also to Caroline and Andrea, we ended up working as a team often, bouncing things off each other. It's been really, again, a really amazing kind of growth experience for me. Also just want to say in sort of the spirit of Wendy and what you read last about all of us kind of have different images and together they make up something, and that's kind of almost formally describes the final piece we're going to talk about, Slut Walk, Anatomy of Protest, which is taking images from all over the place and input from so many people she knew that were in her life, and coming up with something. So I just wanted to mention that I think we'll be trying to find kind of talk about some stylistic things like that occurred. And then one more thing, just before I go to how I know Wendy, which is I've known Wendy since shortly after I was a student at what was then OCA. I graduated in 1981. And then I met Wendy about 5 years later, I think, 4 or 5 years later. I think she was a student here, I'm not sure. Yes, she was a student here at that time. And I think in retrospect, I can see we came from similar backgrounds, which is we both came from a kind of small town and rural upbringing in southwestern Ontario. Both had sort of United Church things going on, kind of kumbaya stuff. We both grew up with a real strong sense of social justice and expected that. We also both grew up, I think, with a real strong sense because of whatever wave of feminism had happened at that time, that we would and could do anything we thought that we wanted, basically. So kind of since then, we both kind of went in different ways. Wendy was very much in the production of objects, as you see in some of the work in her early work, and then quite early on started working in other media, in both photographic based and video. So we'll get into more of that later, but I think one of the important things for me is that we kept up a conversation for many, many years, and we always were willing to argue about things that we didn't agree with, and a lot of it was theoretical or political, and we didn't think, oh, she doesn't think the same as me, she mustn't like me. Never ever like that. We both appreciated each other's different points of view and different positions, and that was has been a very, I think, powerful thing in my life to keep a conversation like that going that can be very difficult and uncomfortable. And it's something that I feel, I guess I woke up this morning and heard about the Pope apologizing, and I was thinking about my main thematic for this talk, which will be sort of the body versus critical mind, and the fact that there needed to be evidence of bodily evidence for an apology to happen, even though a lot has been known for a long time. That really says something, and it says that I think that we all, at least I feel as a settler, coming from a settler background, there are a lot of conversations that haven't been had in public, although we acknowledge the land, then what do we do next? What's the reparation? What do we have a conversation about land back? Do we come up with, anyway, things like that, which I know Wendy was always very impatient about that too. She was always pushing that limit of, okay, what next? What are we going to do? So I just wanted to put that out there, that sort of those things came with me into this talk, and I'm going to hand it back to
Thank you. So I met Wendy in Ian Carr-Harris's class. Caroline Langill was a student there as well. And Ian set up the class in a way that we had to debate. We were in teams and we would be debating issues all the time. So there was a very argumentative class, and maybe that's where we all came into art as well. And then after, so I got to know her at OCA when I was a student here, and then after Wendy and Caroline graduated, they graduated a year ahead of me. They initiated a collective called Spontaneous Combustion, and so all of us were part of Spontaneous Combustion, and we really worked together it was very self-motivated, self-organized collective. We did a show at the old Massey Ferguson building at Shaw and King, and we rented a big suite, business suite kind of thing at Queen and Young, and we took the show also to London. So these were different shows, and we had about 15 members, and we worked quite collaboratively. So there was a lot of that kind of energy about making work and getting work, and discussions around work as well. And then years later, I was assistant dean at OCAD, and Catherine Knight hired Wendy to come on and do some administrative work as well. So we worked closely at that point. And then years later, Wendy was associate dean and I was chair. And I have memories of sitting on the floor with cards, trying to schedule all the faculty and laughing, around just the kind of things that we were doing at the time. So there was a lot of, over the years, we've worked very closely in different kinds of roles. And then, when we were remembering one evening, this is just an example of, we had a dinner at my house, and the integrated media faculty and some of the sculpture installation faculty, Rebecca was there too, and we were arm wrestling, the women. And I'm sure, I think we both remember that Wendy instigated that, the arm wrestling. So those are the kinds of ways that we all interacted. And of course, Wendy was a very constant friend, and her work reminds me of the friendship. So I'm going to both read and be extemporaneous in my delivery, but I thought I would start with the context of experimentation in our production in Toronto. Art video works primarily in Canada, and the local community here have a very rich and deep history. And Wendy's work emerges from the wider conversation that artists were having very much around late 80s and early 90s, and addressing issues of racialization, sexuality, AIDS activism, and gender formation. And this was very much part of her formation at that time, as well as local artists that were doing work. And American artists, we cite Marlon Riggs in the brochure essay, but somebody like him, his work was really pivotal to Wendy in terms of thinking about this integration of sexuality and gender and racialization and all of those that make up one person in all their richness. And so it was a rich combination of personal narrative, the larger discourses, and also the deconstructive impulses of semiotic analysis that we had learned at OCA as we were students. It was part of our education. We were also reading the same books that many of you might have also been reading: Bell Hooks, Judith Butler, Stuart Hall, Edward Said, Donna Haraway. That was part of the conversation. So I think that's the kind of larger context in which Wendy's work comes out of that time. Artists were inhabiting different existing forms and trying to break them apart. There was also big conversation, maybe not as heated, but still relevant, about using appropriated imagery. Which images are appropriate to reappropriate, and which ones are culturally specific and not for the taking. And when I was talking to Johanna Householder about this talk, and I was just like, what am I going to talk about? And she said, I want to know, she said, the works seem to be very disparate, like they're very different in the ways that they're constructed and what they're about. And I thought, actually, they all use appropriated imagery, and that was very significant. If we think, once we go through it, we'll see that none of the images were images that Wendy actually shot herself. These are all images that she then combines and recombines in ways. And they very much also reflect the way that artists were working, especially in the 90s. So there's a very 90s sensibility, especially when I talk about My Heart Divine. So at a certain point, Wendy was done with sculptural work. A few of us remember her stating, "I'm done with making objects, I want to do video." But her impulse, I think, towards materiality and object making was still strong, because even in her last show around Slut Nation and Anatomy of Protest, though the Slut Nation video was central to the work, she still made referential stills and objects that reinforced the reality of objects, their constructedness, and their weight of meaning in the world. So as much as I think video was really something that she was, I think she felt kind of spoke to the ways she wanted to talk about things in the world. She was still very much connected to object making. Delving into the realm of digital experimentation, the manipulation of the image, mostly through editing, certainly echoed her approach to previous sculptural works. Not unlike what she often did with objects, Wendy did see the potential in dilapidated objects. Some of her furnishings in her home were from rehabilitated, discarded items that she found on the roadside. And as you can see, with the fine craft that she brings to her construction, she did that with these kind of objects that she found and then made into her home furnishings. As with art objects, also with images, found footage, internet sources, or even what we might call second-hand or gifted moving images. Wendy's videos are all constructed from other people's images. But these images, through editing, juxtaposition of image, sound, and music, or her own framing and narration take on significance and significations of expanding meanings, reorientations to the issues at hand. It takes a lot to see the value in discarded items, other people's images, to see the signs and contemporary meanings and values. And it takes a dedication to craft, be it with physical objects or time-based media, to understand what works and what doesn't work, and how to tell a story, and how to make your audience question its assumptions, to have them look and relook at the dominant messages of which they are a part. And so we're going to start with Supposing It Was Your Sister, which there are three video works in this show, but we're starting with one that is not. I think, Rebecca, do you?
Yeah, so this is, I've just brought, because this is the only image that isn't in the exhibition, so I just brought it on my wee iPad, and this is a video installation with 5 monitors and a rotating stool in the middle. And it's a piece that Wendy did she developed it while doing an MFA at Concordia and had a thesis exhibition there. And then she showed it in a slightly different form a year or two later in Vancouver, and it was actually curated by Andrea Fatona, the same Andrea Fatona that curated this exhibition. And I last night found this image that's actually the piece with Wendy sitting in it. And I'll just try and describe it very, very quickly. It's a 5-monitor piece, and it originated, to go back to Wendy's, actually that's something Wendy and I used to do a lot, was go and pick up garbage on the street. And one day she found a carton, a big box of files, and they were files that were court documents from a trial in the States about a lynching. And it was very, very upsetting, and it was, the event was described from different people's points of view, many different people's points of view, and it was all transcribed. And so Wendy became very interested in this material, and she did a lot of research into images that she found at that time. To research images, newspaper images was quite a big deal, but she found newspaper images and similar incidents. And so she constructed this work that has all of these people who testified at the trial, which it becomes clear that there was no crime, that this is all a projection, and the piece is about white supremacy, really, and Wendy was working with groups against white supremacy movements at the time. So this is but it's like a forensic kind of taking apart of all these people's different, and presenting them all these different points of view, and then you, the viewer, are in the middle, and you can turn around and listen and see everybody's different point of view, but at some point you're implicated, you have to presumably make some kind of decision or walk away.
And the people on the monitor are also rotating as well.
Right. Some of them are also rotating, so there's very much a kind of uncomfortable shift going on within the work, and a challenge. And oh, sorry, let me just go on. Find the last. Yes, and it is again like it's such an embodied experience, the work, and we weren't able to reproduce it, unfortunately. It's very difficult to get all that equipment right, it's all ancient, and to get it all up and working in the time we had wasn't possible. So we're working on a single channel work that we hope someday may go out to be seen. It wasn't appropriate for this exhibition, but at some point we hope that you'll be able to see it. So in that work, this is a work that was a break away from, I mean, there is a connection to the appropriated imagery for sure, and to other investigations that Wendy was doing in her work. At around the same time, she made a piece out of magazines over there, which is also using appropriated mainstream imagery, and really starting to critique. And the critique is around how a body exists within this kind of mediascape. So it's kind of beginning to really to work out what are the issues there, what are the kind of contradictions in terms of seeing and experiencing a work like that. Do you want to go?
Yeah, actually, I'm realizing I have to correct myself because with supposing it was your sister, Wendy did shoot that stuff, but it was reconstructed from, so it was original footage, but it was reconstructed testimony, as it were. So that it's true, because none of the works in here have that same thing. Yeah, so Wendy's wrote just a tiny bit in relationship to that work, and this is her text. She says, this video installation is a work based on testimonies of white citizens of Duluth, implicated in the lynching murders of 3 black men in 1920. In focusing upon the Duluth lynchings, I hope to provide viewers a historical understanding of white women's implication in racist systems of oppression. This interrogation is intended to further evoke questions of the construction of whiteness and how contemporary notions of white protectionism and white power, strongly rooted in this history, continue to perpetuate racist and sexist hatred and violence. So it's very pointed, like she knew what she was doing, basically, in terms of and I think what's significant about this piece is that it's early 90s, and a lot of the discourses around race and racism and racialization had not really focused on whiteness and white privilege at that time. And so she was doing that work in many ways in a very prescient way, and that word comes to my mind all the time about this work and a number of the pieces here, that there was a prescience, and speaking to white supremacy was quite radical for that time. And the work reverberates through subsequent discourses. You know, there's books like White Trash that came later, and when Black Lives Matter was happening, I just was like, this is so direct, continually directed at this continuum. And then her connections made between queer making, queerness, queer bodies, racialization, what we call intersectionality now, was very much and also in terms of class and subsistence and poverty, it was very much grounded in her experience and her breadth of engagement in her communities, in research, and in her intellectual inquiry. It was, I think it was so related there. The early 90s was a time in which so many communities, Indigenous, immigrant, and of color, were producing media that directly questioned hegemonic cultural practices. And at the time I was working at Images Festival, and we were really kind of conscious of trying to be showing more of that kind of work. And so I know that was very much part of the conversation that was being had. The subaltern was speaking, and Wendy was listening and internalizing the critiques, self-reflexively identifying her locations within systems of gender, sexual, and racial oppression. And that's where that word comes from, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just add to that. I remember at the time talking to her about Marlon Riggs. She was so impressed and inspired by his work. But also, I should mention that this is coming just kind of, the AIDS crisis was not far behind, and we'd all lost friends, and we'd all seen how certain politics played out, where people couldn't get their meds that they needed and had to struggle and fight and protest for everything. And I think that was, we can't underestimate that as a kind of what was propelling this kind of wanting to move into this kind of work, and kind of out of an art world context a little bit, like doing research outside of that context. Can
I just jump in there?
Yeah.
This is just for students. If you haven't seen Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied, please look it up, because I know for me it was a really pivotal kind of a documentary that combined this way in which he combines, there's a personal narrative, there's a kind of sense of looking at queer blackness, but this is like early 90s as well. And is something that's worth seeing, both in that historical context and then seeing the relevance of it to this moment and this time as well.
Yeah, and one more thing about Marlon Rees, because it's incredible work, but I think what was so compelling is it actually creates community. It constructs community. It's made with a community. It kind of, when it's shown, it kind of expands that community, and I think that was something that was so compelling at the time as well, that situation. Also, as Andrea was saying, Andrea Fatona, that Wendy, supposing it was your sister, was examining the roots of race from her subject position and being very well aware of structural racism, how it works. And that was a time that I remember so many discussions about race, class, and gender. And we sort of analyzed things from one point, and then, but what about this? And then analyze from this. And there wasn't a lot of kind of making things, comparing between, or making it, what is the word I'm looking for? Intersection. There wasn't intersectionality, thank you. It was like, and then that started to shift during this time, and we had bell hooks with incredible critiques that were totally intersectional, and again, this sort of excitement of a lens that made sense to look at the world with, rather than trying to stuff it all into these kind of old things that didn't work anymore. So I think that was good. Okay, and then, I was going to just go and talk a bit, should I go into the next piece? So I'm going to go back a little bit to the whole appropriation issue, and
do you want? We're going to be looking at this piece here. Rebecca's going to speak about this little piece with the monkey here.
Yeah, detruned. And this again came at a time quite a bit after supposing it was your sister, and then if we think of what went on in the world, this is about 2003, I think. So 9/11 happened, and the horrors of the images that we saw come out of Abu Ghraib at that time, and a kind of the horrors of the backlash and the wars. And so also at that time, theoretically, a lot of work, and actually when in Montreal, there was the work of Martha Fleming and Lynn Lapointe, and they did an incredible piece called the Musée de Science, so it's the Museum of Science, where they occupied an entire building, and it was like such a critique of both the methodologies and even the tools of scientific endeavor in a gendered sense, how women had been contained and defined by a scientific knowledge. And so and also a lot was coming out in terms of critiques of, I don't know if you know about the work of Charcot and Freud, and the way certain psychological or psychiatric conditions were invented that really were abusive of the women, the patients that they had. So she was this work came out of that whole time of looking at a Western history of science that had been very violent towards women consistently, over and over. Even in the definitions, there's a violence often, right? And so also this piece is using some found appropriated images again and music. And I hope you've all had a chance to see it, because it's a very moving, it's a short piece. But this came also after this kind of hitting a wall about a relationship to objects and the history of the art object, I think, and a kind of minimalism that is very just about the materials, and there's nothing else there. So I remember I used to make a joke about dead life, make a work that's called Dead Life instead of Still Life. It's like, so we're just feeling like there's an impatience with that as a limitation, that definition of the art object as having to be of a certain kind of minimalist material and only speak through that. And so I think that this piece to my left, the magazine piece, is starting to say, oh, I'm going to start. Actually, I think it's gesturing a little bit to a piece by Liz Magor made in 1980 called Production, and it was an entire wall of a gallery made of bricks that are made of compressed old newspapers. In a way, like that is a material minimalist work par excellence, I think. It kind of gestures to some other things, but it's still there just as material. Whereas Wendy in this piece has a wall of magazines, but she's very much going into the complexities of how we are formed, how our identities are kind of manipulated and formed through media images. And we're left with little cutouts of where we can stand, kind of. So looking again, shifting away from an object in a gallery to how images work in the world, how we are made and affected by them. And then this was a specific found piece of film shot by American psychologist Harry Harlow. And he did experiments where I think it's called attachment theory, where he moved baby monkeys from their mothers to gain insight into the workings that touch has on normal development. So he took the monkeys from their biological mothers, gave them two inanimate surrogate mothers. One was a simple construction of wire and wood, and the second was covered in foam rubber and soft terry cloth. We can kind of guess what they're trying to prove, that we'd rather be with soft terry cloth than wire and wood. I don't know why we had to have these two fellows do this elaborate experiment and put these monkeys through this hell, right? So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that the actual film from the experiment with the monkey, who we don't know what its fate was after, I'm sure it was great. And then Wendy has added this achingly beautiful song to it. So if you haven't had time to see it, maybe you can see it after. It's a beautiful work.
And then you can see that she's reproduced the mechanical mother, or the whatever,
Yeah,
the surrogate mother.
Yeah.
But it's actually reproduced in bronze. But even there's a way in which she's reproducing the tactility that would have been, but it's in bronze, which is just amazing. But I didn't actually want to speak about this because it's such an emotional piece. It's actually a very devastating piece in many ways. So yeah.
So I got the job.
Yeah, so Rebecca got the job.
Okay, you can go talk about that.
We're going to talk about this one. Actually, if people want to go to that end, and I'll stand on this side. That would be great. So this piece is called My Heart Divine. It was commissioned by Nikki Forrest and Nelson Henricks, who live in Montreal, or lived in Montreal at the time. It was at their invitation that she produced a piece which described, they asked her to make something about what your heart as a profession. Like if you had to do a piece about your heart as a profession, what would that profession be? So from the V-tape catalog, which I assume is Wendy's words because we all put our own words in there. So she says, so how does one describe the heart as a vocation or calling which professes a specific body of knowledge, and how can one impart that metaphor for the heart in 2 minutes flat, which she made in 4 minutes? You can't. My Heart Divine combines the ancient and hopeful science of the water diviner with the holy and mostly hopeless quest to find divine love. So viewers may first assume that the heart profession is the diviner, that Wendy's choice of twinning the heart's deep desire, its longings, with the metaphor of the dowsing is straightforward. But it may also be the businessman that she refers to later, who's cautious in their investments. Or it also may be the pornographer reclaiming the pleasure of watching lesbian sex. As she states in the video, I wasn't handed a map in this enterprise. Finding love may be as random or as intuitive as looking for and finding water under the ground. Under the surface, the diviner explains, and the diviner in the video says, trying to turn your antennae to something you don't know the answer to. That's what divining is, that you're looking for something for which you don't even have the answer. The video is comprised of a few strands. There's appropriated images again, worshippers that drop to their knees in a kind of reverence, and those are kind of bookend the video. There's lessons in dowsing and finding water with archival footage of children and adults attempting to divine. There's these electronic and scientific measurements, and there's lesbian porn and its appropriation of the penis, and then the beating heart. There's something very 90s about this work. It actually does remind me of Nelson Henrich's work as well, of pieces like Shimmer that used appropriated images as well, others, and then there's a clever and humorous works. Also, it reminds me of Steve Ranke's work in a certain kind of way as well. But also, these inhabit these psychic dreamscapes, as it were. But in here, what's not appropriated is Wendy's voice. Wendy's voice is very strong, and there's a weaving of a sincere question. Would it be possible to have a divining rod to find love and care and attention and to alleviate longing? And with that, if you, in that moment where she says that, there's a kind of subtle humor, and because of the double entendre, the divining rod and the penis rod, and also hearing, and when I was thinking about that, I could hear her laughing at her own cleverness. Like there's just something that she would have taken delight in having done in that. It's powerful to hear her voice in this work and also in the Slut Nation work. And it's still fresh and inquiring, and it still seems very alive in so many ways. What's interesting here is that all the other video works address violence and violations, except for this one, My Heart Divine. It's vulnerable, but hidden between humorous admissions, her attraction to women who cry a lot, maybe it's the high water content, wondering if she may need a more scientific approach in divining for love, or the admission of her cautiousness in trust and in love. And so this piece, I think, really speaks to something, a very deep longing that Wendy had as well. I don't know if people want to ask any questions around either of the works before we go. We're going to go to Slut Nation, which is the last but longest and most substantial piece. Anybody have any questions or thoughts before we move on? Okay, we're going to go then to this room, and there's some chairs there, and there's a bank as well. So please make yourselves comfortable in the space. It would be quite fun and nice to be able to watch it together and then talk about this piece, but it's 36 minutes, and some of you might have already seen it all as well. How many of you have? How many have seen this work? Not everyone. Okay. Okay.
Well, I hope it makes sense having not seen it. You have to
Right.
stay and watch it after it.
So I find myself closer to this work than any of the others, and partly it was because Rebecca and I were actually at the Slut Walk with Wendy. We didn't plan to be. We both brought our cameras, as we are wont to do, because we document everything. And also I think both of us are close to it because we were with Wendy as she was processing and editing the work. I know when she showed me some rough cuts. I actually suggested Anatomy of a Protest as the subtitle. There was a lot of back and forth that we had and conversations around the work.
yeah, also we should say that we both have a pretty long history doing activist video work, so it's kind of a train that we're used to, and we're coming out of an art context doing activist video work, and that's a particular thing because it's kind of activist video work that's coming from somewhere else. Sometimes comes from a more kind of investigative, media situations, but the kind of way that we go about the work is a little bit different than that usually. I just wanted to mention, I think Stuart Hall was brought up earlier, but I've thought a lot about Stuart Hall in relation to this work, and again that shift that Wendy made in terms of analyzing how media works, and then how it's decoded, and then we kind of reinvest it with codes. And it's something that again, I talked so many times with Wendy for years and years about the way that representational codes or tropes get repeated. They get stuck in this trough and repeated over and over. And I think it's even more so now in a way with algorithms and things. So you get these kind of tropes that you can't get out of, you get stuck in, like her cutout shapes in the magazines too, right? Like once that shape's there, it's really hard to change those shapes that we get into without even knowing we got into them. So I think that was like such a big, it's still, I think even more today, like we're at least I'm very aware of that a lot, about how powerful the media is, but also this is coming with the slut walk, but right after the G20. And the G20 in this city, I don't know how many of you were around for it, but it completely was a game changer for many, many people, not just activists, many, many people who had to really look hard at what they were being shown. I had forgotten all about this fellow, Scott Mills. Has anybody heard of Scott Mills? I'm sure a lot of you have heard about things that came out of the G20 with Blair was the police chief, and he got over $1 billion to orchestrate this huge spectacle. Well, Scott Mills was the Toronto Police's first social media expert. He ran their first social media department that opened 2 months before the G20. So they were hot on it, right? Like this was not the things that we were shown during all of that. We should have been critiquing every second. And so I think a lot of people were very dismayed by how that went down, the largest mass arrest in Canadian history, the complete lack of justice and accountability. And so Wendy was, I know, furious about it. And that's, I think when the slut walk came up, and it was a policeman who caused the whole slut walk kerfuffle. Does anybody remember what happened, how that started? I think you do.
Yes. So
what was his name?
Sanguinetti was the police, and he had been invited to York to speak to a bunch of students, and he said, "I probably shouldn't say this, but you need to be careful." I've got the words. I'm paraphrasing. Don't dress like a slut, basically, if you don't want to get raped. That was what he said. And in a paraphrase. But just to give you a little bit of background about this piece, especially because there are people here who haven't seen the work. This video and some of these images, as well as many more, were curated by Barbara Fisher and first shown in December of 2014 at the Justina Barnaky Gallery at U of T. And so the video was in one room, and then there was a much larger room with a lot of reconstructed objects. So some of the things, like the bottle, you see the bottle man here, and then she recreates the bottle. There's a character there called Daryl Diamond K, who's got this polka dot outfit. Well, she remakes the outfit, or those are the shoes that Daryl K wore. So she took these signs that you just saw with badminton rackets. She remakes the signs. So she kind of gives this kind of material evidence, though it's actually constructed evidence. So there's this whole thing around what we've all been grappling with false news and with surveillance and intervention and then the main narrative here is that when Sanguinetti had stated this, it really took off because so many people objected to him saying that women have to dress in a certain way not to be raped. And so organizers started the Slut Walk, which then took off internationally. Like there were a lot of slut walks that happened at that time in response to
all over the world.
All over the world. But when we were at the Toronto Slut Walk, what was really interesting was that I blithely went with my camera. I was just shooting. And I don't know about you, so you can speak to what you were aware of, because I think you were even more aware of it than I was at the time. I didn't have a sense that there was this kind of undermining of the message in that moment. But Wendy really caught it. She was attuned to it right in that moment. And it was only when she said to them, like, "Are you with the police?" And I was just like, what is she talking about? It just did not occur to me in that. And so once she said that and I picked up that cue, I started to point the camera more at what probably were either undercover cops or hired performers or something that she allows us. We'll talk about that in a bit. But what was your experience?
Yeah, at first I didn't realize because it was a large march, and when we were marching, it was when we all got jammed together in front of police headquarters, and then I was actually with Wendy at that point, and so she was, and it was, we were I was standing right in front of the vehicle where they were using to change their costumes and stuff. But these guys are on the roof, and I kind of, this guy, I have a lot of footage, I shot this. I have a lot of footage of this guy yelling at me, "I'll do whatever I want," and because I'm filming him and he's filming me, right? And Wendy's beside me saying, "Are you a cop?" And so it was a very tense situation because they were not supposed to be filming the stage, and they were anyway. It was a tense and complicated situation. My take on it was that I thought these guys were friends of what's Sanguinetti?
Sanguinetti?
I thought they were friends of Sanguinetti who thought, we'll just go and make these people look like idiots. This is what they're up to. That was sort of my take on what was going on. At that point.
And any of those possibilities could be
Anything.
true. Right. So what Wendy does in the video is really make us question who's there. When I've taken the students, a number of students through this show now, and I've watched this video many times, including to make sure that the captioning was correct, all of that. And each time I see it, I just think this piece is incredibly constructed. Mm-hmm. It's just, there's a kind of circular way in which you come back, you look at stuff, and then you have to look at it again, and it changes in the way that you see the signs. And then you go back, and then she kind of elaborates the narrative and her questioning through the kind of 3-act structure, or the structures of theater, as she points out. And one of the things that I do when I bring students here is to ask them, what makes this an artwork and not a piece of journalism? And so we can come back to that, but that's something that's really, I think, specific to thinking about this work.
Where was I? I guess I'll just go back to the issues around this kind of staging. This was at the G20, and she mentions that in this video about how that worked. And what was the other? Oh, yeah, I just wanted to point out some things that were going on in the world and in Wendy's world before this, that I think, again, sort of was inspiration for this work. And one of them was the Montreal Massacre and the way that it was portrayed in the media. And I think Liz brought this up at the panel the other night about how she thought, oh, it's just a nut, he's just some nut. And Wendy said, no, this is misogyny. And I think that was a conversation that a lot of people had for a long time and maybe are still having in certain extents. But just that, I think, was very profound. And also, Wendy had been working on a malpractice suit. It was before this, wasn't it? Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, her
Yes,
father
yes,
was
yes.
misdiagnosed and died, and she had prepared a very comprehensive suit to propose to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and she was not successful. And I think she was deeply disturbed by the fact that the way that our structures work and our laws often don't support life. They support, actually, property often and objects, right? They don't necessarily support life. And I think she became very much more radical about her response to things like this than she was before those events, because I think it radicalized her in the sense that it's so important to take that stand, I guess, to insist on that life be respected, and women, of course.
And the Swiss cheese piece and the helmet piece, those two object pieces in that are connected to this incident of her father's death, and to the kind of way in which the Swiss cheese theory, where you kind of line up the holes and see where's the place where there weren't safeguards or things that would allow something horrific to happen, like the Air India bombing, etc. All of those she connects in a chapter that she wrote about some of this work as well.
Yeah. Yeah, the shoes. There's a funny story around the shoes, eh? The shoes, the Daryl Diamond.
You mean
Running
what's
shoes.
identified in the video?
Yeah. If you've seen it, you probably remember that this guy changes his outfit, but he doesn't change his shoes, and they're so recognizable, right? That when you see them, you realize, whoa, that's kind of a hard one to dispute.
So one of the things that Wendy's doing with this is, and the whole discussion about whether this is an artwork or whether this is a piece of journalism, I think is really important. One of the students to whom I asked said, "Well, I don't think that makes that distinction is necessary." And I think in this day and age we like to blur things, and everything is interdisciplinary, and there's like a lot of ways in which things blur into each other. But when I think about a court of law, it is actually important whether something is investigative and journalistic, and whether it is an artwork. And part of what I think Wendy is doing with this piece is she's asking us to question. She's asking us to question the images we see, the images in media that we see, but also to question the systems of power and coercion that are part of the state. And here she's questioning whether and to what extent these characters who undermined the message of the slut walk during the slut walk are actually provocateurs. Are they the police? Are they performers that the police have hired? There's never a conclusion, and we don't really know. But we do know that we need to question, and that's really very much what's at stake in this piece for her.
For us too.
And for us. And what was the message of the slut walk? There's one sign in there that enumerates: rape is caused by misogyny, check. Rapists, check. Institutional tolerance, check. Structural violence, check. Not by women's clothing, or women's clothes. And so there's one aspect of this work is that it's asking the questions. Another is that she places the work within the context of an art show. She creates these artifacts, and she creates these objects that are both reinforcing the message, but also having to make us question their construction as well. So there's that aspect of it
Can
as
I
well.
too?
Yes.
In a sense, you can, like, having seen it so many times, it's almost like in a single channel work, she's doing a little bit of what she did as supposing it was her sister, which is kind of create this thing that we get, this web we're caught in and are implicated in, and have to kind of make some kind of decision about, right? So I think as a viewer, she's kind of constructed that in a single channel work, the similar thing she was trying to do.
Yeah, and she's placing herself in it, which is very different as well in the way that she places herself than a journalist might. Sometimes they might be in it, but not in the same way of the implications and the personal implications. Here she tells us that she went undercover in a white supremacy group at one point. So she's very attuned to the ways that the signs and the messages are there. And there again, we can draw a link to supposing it was your sister, to that piece we spoke about earlier, because there's a direct line between those pieces in terms of her consciousness and in terms of thinking through white supremacy, thinking through the state and what the state sanctions, and the kind of the violence of the state in many ways as well. And it's time. Are we done? Okay.
Well, except I want to hear what
Yes.
people have to say. I want to hear the questions.
So, yeah, I think so too. And I think the last thing I would say is really about just the way this work has resonated for students who have seen it. Some students spoke about being at a protest at X University and being aware of being surveilled, and so how this piece really spoke to them about those kinds of ways of being, of their protest or their voices being. And then also, of course, the G20, as we mentioned, was a really significant. So yeah, I think we can open it up. For some of you haven't seen it, but feel free to still ask questions. There's no stupid questions. And those of you who have seen it might also have some questions. So anyway, we're gonna open it up. And by the way, thanks for coming, because as we noted, this was, a lot of people thought this was going to be on just a virtual talk, and I, for one, was very happy that it is in person. So I'm really, thank you for coming, because I thought, you know, most people who thought, who registered were like in England or other places and weren't able to come. So, yeah. Anyway, are there any questions or thoughts about this work, or how it's affected you, or any of the work too? It doesn't just have to be the video work. Yes.
I just appreciate you situating her artwork in particular points in time. I remember the AIDS period. I remember, the G20. I remember, in this walk, and I'm wondering, where was I at that time? What was I doing? And I didn't attend. Why didn't I attend?
Because life is busy.
Well, that's kind of you to say, but that I find that was very important. And the fact that, she was talking about things before it became, like, now we're familiar with we lived the Me Too movement. Mm-hmm. And she was talking about this over 10 years before, or 20 years before this, right? So.
Yeah.
What it must have been like for her back then talking about this,
Yes.
I mean, imagine it must not have been easy. And did she have a support system? Like, did she have support,
Yeah.
Anyway, that's what I was thinking about during this
I think that's a really important question about support systems. Like, for anybody who does activism or this kind of video activism, then I think it's really a big and important question. By the way, I should just mention, if you don't want to be on camera, just let us know, or if you don't want it to be in the broadcast, just let us know. But yeah, I think that those are all really relevant observations about what would have been at stake for her. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes she probably felt supported and sometimes she probably didn't.
I can imagine it would be a weight on
Yeah,
her.
yeah. I mean, even with this piece, at a certain point, I think she asked us if we would work with her on it, and we both said no, because we gave her our material. I said, here, but I was working on a couple other things, and I just, and then when she produced this, it was just like, oh my God, like, yeah.
I think at the same time, I was working on a work that took a few years that was someone who had documented 36 cases of the Toronto police beating up marginalized folks. One of them had died from the beatings. So we were working with people who are very vulnerable and filming them, and they were being followed by the police. They're being harassed. It was clear what happens if you do things that aren't appreciated. Then there are repercussions. So I was really aware of where she was going and was worried about it and would talk to her about it. I was working with someone who was a seasoned activist working in doing that kind of work. And all of the people we worked with had a care circle around them, professionals, all of the marginalized folks. But myself and the other person I worked with didn't have anything, and it was really hard emotionally, even not being the only one. Like I had him to kind of bounce things off of and compare, and it was really hard, and it was scary a lot of the time. So I would run into Wendy and I would say, and she would tell me these things, and I would say, oh yikes, like that sounds terrible. And she didn't have a lot of experience in this kind of work, and she didn't have a big enough experienced support system around her, and that was very worrisome to me at the time, and to other people. I think it was hard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think anybody who's doing activist work is vulnerable, number one. Artists are often vulnerable in the work that they do. But this, and for all of us who've just been going through this 2-year pandemic, there's so many other vulnerabilities that have bubbled up because some of the structures or distractions or any of the other kinds of ways that we are used to alleviating that vulnerability is not there. Mm-hmm. And definitely those issues around how to be secure in the knowledge that what we're believing is true is really it's crazy making sometimes, right? Because we have to be discerning about who we're trusting, what we're trusting, who we're speaking to, all of those kinds of things. So we've really all been thrust into those kind of vulnerabilities in many ways as well. So yeah, that may be the place to, we're not going to neatly wrap it up. We're going to stay in that vulnerable place. Thanks so much for coming, and thanks for the,
Thanks,
Thank you.